And welcome to this distance lesson. This is lesson number 9. This is the second lesson on the poem The Identification by Roger McGough. So, for this lesson, you're going to need a copy of the poem The Identification by Roger McGough, and there is a copy of this in the presentation and also in the handout sheet. And you will need some paper. So, as you should be aware, this series of lessons is based on a poem. The poem is being used as a stimulus. And during this lesson, you're going to use the poem to create a short piece of drama, and you're going to plan out a story, which you're going to be using next week for a longer piece of drama that you're going to write. And today, you're going to create 3 freeze frames based on your storyline, and I'll explain how you'll do that at the end of this lesson. So, the first task, this is a knowledge retrieval task. This should take you about 5 minutes. So what I'd suggest that you do is, once I've gone through the task with you, pause this video, do the knowledge retrieval task, and then move on. I'd like to try and answer these questions without rereading the poem. And this is just testing your knowledge, how much you can remember about the poem. So firstly, what was the poem actually about? Remember, it's called The Identification. What or who was being identified? Second question, who is the speaker of the poem? It's not clear at the start, but the speaker does reveal their identity at the end of the poem. Thirdly, what are the clues to the identity of the victim? And there are at least 4 clues that provide the speaker with evidence to know who the victim is. And finally, why did the speaker think that Stephen had the cigarettes? And if you remember the poem, you should know who Stephen is, and you should know why the speaker thought that he had the cigarettes. What you should do now is pause this video for about 5 minutes, have a go at answering those questions, and then unpause the video. These are the answers. I hope that you had a go at these, and I hope that you paused the video. So the first question, what was the poem about? The poem was about a boy called Stephen who has been killed in an explosion, and his father has been asked to identify the body. We know that it's his father because towards the end of the poem, he says, "He wouldn't disobey me, not his father." Clues to Stephen's identity, well, the things that help the father identify him: the sweater he's wearing, his scout belt, the penknife, and the main thing is the keyring that his gran gave him. Stephen also has some cigarettes. His father doesn't think it's Stephen because he has cigarettes. Then he decides that quite possibly, after he's agreed it's Stephen, that he was minding them for one of the older boys. And whether or not that's true, well, we don't know, and we'll probably never find out. What I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to reread the poem. And what I've done is I've recorded it myself. You might have heard this last week, but if you didn't, I will play it for you again. The Identification by Roger McGough. So you think it's Stephen? Then I'd best make sure. Be on the safe side, as it were. Oh, there's a mistake. The hair, you see, it's black. Now Stephen's fair. What's that? The explosion. Of course, burnt black. Silly of me. I should have known. Then let's get on. The face. Is that a face, I ask? That mask of charred wood? Blistered? Scarred? Could that have been a child's face? But the sweater, wear intact, looks in fact all too familiar. But one must be sure. The Scout belt. Yes, that's his. I recognise the studs he hammered in not a week ago. At the age when boys get clothes conscious now, you know. It's almost certainly Stephen. But one must be sure. Remove all trace of doubt. Pull out every splinter of hope. Pockets. Empty the pockets. Handkerchief. Could be any schoolboy's. Dirty enough. Cigarettes? Oh, this can't be Stephen. I don't allow him to smoke, you see. He wouldn't disobey me, not his father. But that's his penknife. That's his all right. And that's his key on the key ring Gran gave him just the other night. Then this must be him. I think I know what happened. About the cigarettes. No doubt he was minding them for one of the older boys, yes. That's it. That's it. That's our Stephen. And that's the poem. The first task that I'd like you to do is thinking a little bit about Stephen himself. Now, we don't know much about Stephen. So what I'd like to think about is what the poem suggests. And this is something that we always do when we're thinking about characters. We look at what are called the given circumstances. And this is the information that a writer tells us. And then what we need to do, if we're acting a character, or in this case trying to work out about a character, is we use those given circumstances to try and fill in the blanks. In this case, we know that he has a scout belt, which tells us that he was probably a Boy Scout. His father describes him as being clothes conscious, and that suggests that he's quite fashionable. What I'd like to think about is using the evidence of the poem, try and write 3 sentences. And I'd like you to write about how you think Stephen's family would like to remember him. So you could start that sentence. Stephen's family would probably like to remember him as being something, because. Second sentence, how might Stephen's friends want to remember him? What sort of things did they used to do together? Is there any evidence to suggest that that might be different to Stephen's family? So you might say, Stephen's friends might like to remember him as being because. And finally, probably the hardest, Stephen as his teachers might remember him. Is there any evidence that you can find in the poem of what Stephen's teachers might have thought of him? Anything that tells us what he might have been like with other children in the school? Give yourself 5 minutes. Again, you might want to go back a little bit and have another look at the poem, or make sure that you've got the poem in front of you to help you. Pause the video, and then when you're ready, move on, and you will see my suggestions for how different people might have seen Stephen. So I'm suggesting the following, and I'm not saying that these are right, I'm just saying these are the best fit that I could come up with. So Stephen's family might remember him as a well-behaved, kind boy because he was a Boy Scout. And as far as they know, not involved in anything bad. And we know this because of the scout belt and the dad's reaction to the cigarettes. Stephen's friends might remember him as quite a cunning boy because he was able to hide what he was doing from his parents. His dad had no idea that he'd been smoking. And the evidence in the poem suggests his dad is shocked by the cigarettes, and the mention of the older boys suggests that he had something to do with them, and maybe they wouldn't have had much to do with him if he hadn't been quite clever. And so Stephen's teachers might remember him as someone who hung around with troublemakers because he was involved with the older boys. And again, that links to Stephen's dad's suggestion about why he had the cigarettes. The next thing I'd like you to do, and again, this should take you about 5 minutes, I'd like you to imagine that you are someone who knew Stephen, maybe a member of his family, one of his friends, one of his teachers, and you've been asked to say something at the funeral. What you're going to do is you're going to write a short speech, a monologue, in other words, describing your memories of Stephen. And you need to make this at least 5 lines. That's 5 sentences long. What are you going to say? And in this case, we're moving beyond the given circumstances because we're making up a new character. And what you can do now is that you can start adding information in. So you can make up information, you can make up details about Stephen's life. And you need to think a little bit about how you might speak. How might you actually say these lines to explain how you would communicate? I'm going to show you an example. This is one I wrote, and you can use this to help you, although I would like you to obviously make up your own. This is a character called John. John is one of Stephen's friends. I've been one of Stephen's friends since we were about 6. I have so many stories about him. I wasn't sure which one to tell. When we bunked off from Scouts, that time we were nearly caught smoking. And that's it, that's 5 lines. Now, obviously, you can write more if you like, but that's the shortest yours should be. I'd like you to spend about 5 minutes writing your own version, and then if you want to, as you've hopefully done in the past, you can have a go at acting it out, making sure that you've added in some stage directions just to give it a bit of impact. This is quite an important task because this and the next task are going to lead up to the work next week where you're actually going to write a short script. We don't know what caused the explosion. That information isn't given to us. So what you're going to do is you're going to use your imagination and your creativity to come up with the answer to this question. The first thing you'd need to do is you need to answer some basic questions. And these are the kind of questions that you need to answer when you're doing any piece of drama based on a stimulus. And again, you can use your imagination. You need to write the answers to the following questions in as much detail as you can, explaining what happened on the day of the explosion. Obvious question, where might it have happened? Was it at school? Was it somewhere else? Second question, when? What might the explosion have happened? And there's 2 different whens here. There's the time of day. Was it morning, afternoon, evening, night? And when in terms of the time period? Is it set in the past or is it set in the present? And that's your decision. What caused the explosion? That's obviously up to you. We don't know what caused the explosion. Why are the cigarettes significant? Well, there's an obvious answer to that question, but you might come up with something else. Stephen was obviously killed in the explosion, so where was he? Was he next to whatever it was exploded? Was he caught in it accidentally? Was he responsible for the explosion? And who else was there? Now, you're going to need to create 2 other characters apart from Stephen. So you need to think who else might have been involved, whether the older boys who were mentioned in the poem or 2 other characters. You're going to spend about 7 minutes writing your answers to this. And it could look a bit like this. These are my answers. I think the explosion maybe took place in an abandoned factory. Some boys have broken into it, and these boys are 3 friends. These are John, James, and Stephen. So John, you might recall, I included in the previous exercise. And they've gone there, they've gone to smoke. And that links to the cigarettes. It also tells us the time of day. And I've set it in the present day for no particular reason, just it seemed a bit easier. And I've decided the explosion was caused because the boys were messing about with some old gas canisters. And the reason I chose those was that I had to work out how to fix a gas canister to our barbecue the other day, and it was in the back of my mind. The cigarettes are important because that explains how they lit the gas. Whatever they were using to light the cigarettes caused the gas canisters to ignite, and Stephen was killed because he was nearest the gas canisters. And that basically sets up the situation that I'm going to explore in the script next week. So Give yourself about 7 or 8 minutes, pause the video. When you've written your answers, move on to the final task. This, I would say, is an optional task. If you have spent about half an hour so far doing the rest of the work, then you don't have to do this one. But if you feel that you've got time or you want to, then you can have a go at this one. And this should take you about 10 minutes. We're thinking at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. And what you need to do is use these to write your script. Now, what I want you all to do is just write down the answers to the questions. Where does the story begin? What happens to lead to the explosion? And what happens after the explosion? But if you're feeling that you're particularly creative or you're at a loose end or you just fancy a go, I'd like you to create these as still images. Now, obviously, we're talking about 3 characters. And unless you're really lucky, you won't be able to have 3 people available to you. I'm suggesting you could use Lego minifigures or Playmobil figures or action figures, or if you're feeling particularly competent with using software, you could do it digitally, or you could sketch them out. At the very least, write down how you think the story begins, what leads up to the explosion, how it ends. But if you want to, you can have a go at creating photographs, and we will use these for the exercise next week. Once you've completed your work, or make sure you've got a copy of it somewhere, and when you've finished it, as per usual, please make sure you send the work to the correct teacher. Have a look at your class and make sure that your work goes to either Miss Bell or to Mr. Earl. And I will speak to you next week.